faithfully delivering value and exploring great books from around the world. Hi, this is Sally from the book club. Today, I'm introducing a book called The Retreat of the Elephants. The subtitle is A Chinese Environmental History. When mentioning elephants, you might recall in the spring and summer of 2021, that group that started from Sichuan-Bana and headed north. During their migration, they roamed through streets and alleys, causing constant incidents, but became the world's most famous viral animals at the time. But you might not know that over 4,000 years ago, the ancestors of these elephants were active in areas like Beijing and Henan. From a historical perspective, their unexpected northward journey in 2021 was just a return after a long retreat. So, how did elephants gradually move from north to south in history? This is the first question that the book we're discussing today aims to address. Of course, this book doesn't focus on the changes in elephants' habitats over time, but rather reveals how ancient Chinese people interacted with the environment over 4,000 years, how they modified it for survival, and how environmental changes shaped their lives in return. The author of this book is Mark Elvin, a renowned overseas sinologist. Born in 1938 in the UK, he graduated from Cambridge University and has taught at universities like Glasgow, Oxford, and Heidelberg. He studies Chinese environmental history because China's written records are extensive and rich, allowing comparison with other nations' histories to bring insights for today's world. The Retreat of the Elephants. This book is the culmination of his research on Chinese environmental history and is hailed as a foundational work by Western scholars. You might find environmental history unfamiliar, so let me explain a bit. Environmental history is a new branch in history, focusing on the relationship between humans and nature, both cooperative and conflicting. In today's world of heightened conflicts, studying it reveals the logic of human nature evolution, helping us understand the essence of current environmental crises. All right, next I'll introduce in three aspects how ancient Chinese people interacted with the environment over 4,000 years. 1. The overall patterns of interaction between ancient Chinese people and the environment, and the main driving forces across different periods. 2. How ancient Chinese people multiplied and developed in various environments. 3. How ancient Chinese perceived the environment. First, let's examine the basic pattern of their environmental interaction from an overall perspective. The author argues that while ancient Chinese environment interactions were complex in detail, their essence followed one main thread: struggling with the environment to develop large-scale agricultural economies. So how did ancient people profoundly transform the environment to develop agriculture? Next, we'll explore three aspects: humans versus wildlife, humans versus forests, and humans versus water resources. First, let's examine ancient people's struggle with wildlife using elephants as our example. In modern China, outside zoos, only Sichuan-Bana in Yunnan retains a small remnant population of wild elephants. But historically, wild elephants were widespread throughout northern China. The Luxi Chengli records that merchants used elephants against the Dongyi people, indicating elephants still existed in the Central Plains during the early Zhou dynasty. But by the late Warring States period, philosopher Han Frazee noted they found elephant bones where elephants once lived in the western suburbs. This suggests elephants likely went extinct along the Yellow River by the late Warring States era. Han Dynasty's Huinanzi mentions abundant elephants in the Yangtze Basin, showing their range had retreated southward. During Tang Song periods, with large-scale development of the Yangtze Basin, elephants retreated further to the Pearl River Basin. By Ming-Qing dynasties, elephants retreated from the Pearl Basin to Yunnan's border regions. So why did elephants retreat step by step from north to south? First, northern climate cooling did drive their southward migration to some extent. But this wasn't the only reason, as elephants failed to fully repopulate the Yangtze-Huai basins even during historical warm periods. The best explanation is that elephants lost their prolonged war against humans, retreating as human settlements expanded. This human-elephant conflict occurred on three main fronts. First, elephants avoid heat and require massive food, needing forest habitats near water or wetlands. But to expand farmland, ancient people cleared forests extensively, destroying habitats and forcing continuous elephant retreat. Next, elephants would go into farmlands to eat crops. Farmers would use all kinds of methods to eliminate elephants to protect their hard-earned harvests. For instance, a Ming Dynasty author once described a story of hunting elephants in Hepu County, Guangxi, in 1547. Local elephants destroyed many crops, and since they couldn't be driven away, officials organized villagers to hunt them. First, they surrounded the elephant herd with wooden fences, then dug trenches around them and set up archers. Once everything was ready, they used fire attacks. Elephants fear heat, so within 3 or 4 days, they all died. The cruelty of the human-elephant war is clearly evident. Lastly, elephant tusks were valuable materials and trunks were considered a delicacy, so humans hunted them extensively. That's the main course of the human-elephant war. But it should be noted that Chinese history saw not just human-elephant conflicts, but also struggles with tigers, deer, wild horses, bison, wolves, peacocks, crocodiles, and other wildlife, all ultimately defeated by humans. Habitats gradually shrank from vast areas to confined spaces, with many species even disappearing completely from the land. All right, after discussing the war between humans and animals, let's look at how humans and forests interacted. As mentioned earlier, the root cause of elephants' retreat was large-scale deforestation. But why did humans engage in such massive deforestation? Because as the population grew, ancient people needed more land for farming. So ancient people deforested on a large scale to open up wasteland, a process that started thousands of years ago. For example, in the Book of Songs, there's a hymn glorifying the Zhou royal family's sacred rule called Huang Yi. It contains lines like, "Clear and screen them, their weeds and shade, repair and level them, their bushes and trees." The general meaning of clear and screen them, repair and level them is to clear shrubs, fell forests, and flatten the land. After all, to live a settled farming life, one first had to clear out a piece of land. Of course, ancient people cut down forests not only for farming, but also because wood was vital for building houses, ships, bridges, heating, cooking, and smelting. Demand kept rising with population growth, and these two reasons took turns as the main driver over time. In ancient times and the early imperial period, deforestation for land reclamation was the main theme, while in the late imperial era, securing wood for production and daily life became the primary driver of large-scale logging. However, excessive deforestation also brought a series of dangers to humans. First, deforestation can disrupt ecosystems and cause water shortages. For example, in Ganzhou district of Zhangye, Gansu, daily life mainly depended on the Haihei River. The river's water primarily came from melted snow in local pine forests. Later, pine forests were cut down, reducing snowfall and causing severe water shortages. Second, forests provided habitats for many wild animals. In the past, if crops failed, people could hunt in forests to supplement income. But shrinking forests meant losing this environmental buffer. Moreover, deforestation also led to shortages of fuel and construction timber. For instance, during the Qing dynasty, shipbuilding faced such timber shortages that trees from gardens and even cemeteries were requisitioned. Finally, and most crucially, deforestation caused severe soil erosion, leading to devastating floods. The most typical case is the Yellow River, which only started turning yellow about 2,000 years ago. The main reason was Qin and Han dynasties promoting farming in the Northwest. Clearing forests along the middle reaches increased silt, raising the riverbed until it became an elevated river. Despite dynasties' efforts to control it, floods remained frequent. All right, that covers human-forest conflicts. Despite costs, ancient people cultivated vast farmlands, but agriculture needs both land and water. Next, let's explore how ancient people interacted with water resources. Water fuels civilization. But China's water distribution is highly uneven. What to do? Massive water projects were built. Yellow River Dike against floods, Dujiangyan for irrigation, Grand Canal for transport, and urban supply systems. For example, the Li Canal, dug in Tang Dynasty, mainly supplied daily water to Yuanzhou, Jiangxi. The author views China's large-scale water projects as largely successful. But in the long term, the costs were extremely high, not only becoming dangerously vulnerable to sudden environmental factors, but requiring constant investment of labor, funds, and materials for maintenance. Oh, this might sound abstract. Let me briefly explain using the example of the seawall project in Hangzhou Bay. Seawalls are tidal barriers built along coastlines to prevent ocean flooding. They not only prevent soil salinization, but also store fresh water for farmland irrigation. Records of seawall construction in Hangzhou Bay date back very early. At least since the Tang Dynasty, numerous seawalls and reclaimed fields were built along Hangzhou Bay's southern shore. Successive dynasties continuously renovated and expanded them, making tremendous contributions to local development. But water projects couldn't solve problems permanently. Constant tidal erosion required regular repairs and reconstruction. According to Shangyu County records in Zhejiang, rebuilding just 6 kilometers of seawall in 1347 consumed about 63,000 logs and 37,000 cubic meters of stone, plus immeasurable labor, imposing heavy burdens on locals. The author argues that large water projects initially boosted economies, but became stifling burdens by the late imperial period, hindering structural economic reforms. He terms this technological lock-in, where older, inferior technology maintained dominance through early establishment, blocking adoption of more advanced methods. No society reshaped its water systems as extensively as China, yet this long struggle turned former strengths into sources of weakness. All right, the basic pattern of ancient Chinese environmental interaction. We've covered it, essentially developing agriculture by expelling animals, overclearing forests, and building water projects. But what were the main drivers behind these actions? Next, let's examine chronologically. The author contends that warfare was the primary environmental driver during Chinese civilization's origins. Tribes constantly warred over resources. Those efficiently controlling scarce human or natural resources gained political, military advantages. Large-scale agricultural development, compared to primitive hunting-gathering, had higher productivity, allowing tribes to support larger armies and win tribal wars. These victories drew more tribes into the process, further solidifying agriculture's dominant role. For example, when Mencius discussed the Duke of Zhou, he wrote, "After Yao and Shun passed, the way of sages declined. Tyrants arose, turning farmlands into parks, depriving people of food and clothing. The Duke of Zhou assisted King Wu in punishing Zhou, driving away tigers, leopards, rhinos, and elephants, delighting all under heaven." This describes the Yellow River Basin circa 1000 BCE. While details may be unreliable, the Duke's efforts to consolidate farming after defeating Shang are evident. In summary, during Chinese civilization's origins, agricultural-driven environmental changes were near byproducts of war. Later, ancient China gradually entered the imperial era. In early imperial times, states drove large-scale environmental transformation by applying governance methods to nature for economic and political control. The most typical case was state-organized water projects. For example, before unifying China, the Qin state mobilized 100,000-plus people to dig the Zhengguo Canal north of Wei River in Shanxi, irrigating 40,000-plus Qing, approximately 267 square kilometers, and transforming Guanzhong into fertile land. Sima Quan even believed this project enabled Qin's unification by significantly boosting national power. Though ever present, the state wasn't always the dominant environmental driver, especially in late imperial times, when market demand gradually took over. In ancient or early imperial eras, deforestation focused on land reclamation, In late imperial times, securing timber for production or living became the main driver. And so, however, excessive deforestation brought serious dangers. First, deforestation could disrupt ecosystems and cause water shortages. For example, in Guangzhou, Zhangye, daily life relied mainly on the Heihei River. The river's water came primarily from snowmelt in local pine forests. After pine forests were cut, snowfall decreased, causing severe water shortages. Secondly, forests provide habitats for many wild animals. In the past, poor harvests could be offset by hunting in forests, but shrinking forests meant losing this environmental safety net. Moreover, deforestation causes shortages of fuel and construction timber. For instance, during Qing Dynasty, shipbuilding faced such timber shortages that trees from gardens and cemeteries were requisitioned.
Deforestation also causes severe soil erosion, leading to devastating floods.
The classic example is the Yellow River, which only turned yellow about 2 millennia ago. Qinhan agricultural expansion cleared forests along its middle reaches, increasing silt until it became an elevated river. Despite dynastic efforts to control it, floods remained frequent. All right, that covers human-forest conflicts. While costly, they created farmlands, but agriculture needs both land and water. Next, let's explore ancient water management. Water fuels civilization, but China's uneven distribution posed challenges. What solutions emerged? China built massive water projects, Yellow River Dike against floods, Dujiangyan for irrigation, Grand Canal for transport, and urban supply systems. For example, the Tang Dynasty's Li Canal supplied daily water to Yuanzhou, Jiangxi. The author considers these large-scale water projects generally successful, but long-term costs were high, vulnerable to environmental shocks and requiring constant resources for maintenance. This may sound abstract. Let me illustrate briefly with Hangzhou Bay's seawall project. Seawalls are tidal barriers preventing coastal flooding. They curb soil salinization and store freshwater for irrigation. In the Hangzhou Bay area, records of seawall construction date back very early. At least since the Tang Dynasty, numerous seawalls and reclaimed fields were built along Hangzhou Bay's southern shore. Successive dynasties continuously renovated and expanded them, making tremendous contributions to local development. But water projects couldn't solve problems permanently. Constant tidal erosion required regular repairs and reconstruction. According to Shanmu County records in Zhejiang, rebuilding just 6 kilometers of seawall in 1347 consumed about 63,000 logs and 37,000 cubic meters of stone, plus immeasurable labor, imposing heavy burdens on locals. The author argues that large water projects initially boosted economies but became stifling burdens by the late imperial period, hindering structural economic reforms. He turns this technological lock-in, where older, inferior technology maintained dominance through early establishment, blocking adoption of more advanced methods. No society reshaped its water systems as extensively as China, yet this long struggle turned former strengths into sources of weakness. All right, the basic pattern of ancient Chinese environmental interaction. We've essentially covered it. In other words, developing agriculture by expelling animals, overclearing forests, and building water projects. But what were the primary motivations driving these actions? Next, let's examine chronologically. The author contends that warfare was the primary environmental driver during Chinese civilization's origins. Tribes constantly warred over resources. Those efficiently controlling scarce human and natural resources gained political military advantages. Large-scale agriculture, compared to primitive hunting and gathering, had higher productivity, allowing tribes to support larger armies and win wars. These victories drew more tribes into the process, further cementing agriculture's dominance. For example, when Mencius discussed the Duke of Zhou, he wrote, "After Yao and Shun passed, the way of sages declined, tyrants arose, turning farmlands into parks, depriving people. Thus, the Duke of Zhou assisted King Wu in punishing Zhou, driving away tigers, leopards, rhinos, and elephants far away, delighting all under heaven." This describes the situation in the Yellow River Basin around the end of the second millennium BCE. While the details may not be entirely credible, the Duke of Zhou's efforts to consolidate farming civilization after assisting King Wu in defeating Shang are clearly visible. In summary, during the origin of Chinese civilization, environmental changes caused by agricultural development were actually just byproducts of war. Later, with the progression of time, ancient China gradually entered the imperial period. In the early imperial period, to develop the economy and consolidate rule, the state applied societal management methods to the natural environment, becoming the main driver for large-scale environmental transformation.
The most typical case was the large-scale construction of water projects organized by state power.
For example, before unifying China, the Qin state mobilized over 100,000 people to dig the Zhengou Canal north of the Wei River in Shanxi, irrigating over 40,000 Qing of land, turning the Guanzhong region into fertile plains.
Sima Qian even believed that the Qin dynasty's ability to unify China relied on this project, significantly strengthening Qin's national power. Of course, throughout history, while the state as a force promoting environmental transformation was always present, it wasn't always dominant. Especially in the late imperial period, market demand gradually became the primary driver. For instance, during the Qing dynasty, in the Qianlong era, the censor He Lin investigated why grain transport ships couldn't head north as scheduled, finding delays in Hubei ships. Jiang Yingke of the Ming dynasty wrote about Guizhou. Burned scars on cliffs turn green with next year's rain. Rivers enter spring villages annually. Moreover, because Guizhou has many mountains and forests, the local environmental buffer was stronger and people often supplemented food supplies through hunting. Wu Guolun of the Ming dynasty mentioned in poetry that the local Miao people practiced slash-and-burn farming and fishing hunting. After farming, if they had energy, they hunted wild boars or deer. In other words, although the Miao had largely become farmers and herders, they could still rely on nature to some extent. Moreover, Miao villages had markets where they could forge their own iron tools, farm implements, build boats, and weave cloth. All right, after discussing Guizhou, from the Miao perspective, let's chronologically examine how Han Chinese gradually integrated. According to records in Guizhou, during the Qin Han periods, the court established commanderies and counties for local management. In Tang Song times, it mainly exercised indirect rule by recognizing local chieftains' hereditary rights. By the Ming-Qing period, to strengthen control over Guizhou, the court implemented the Daitu Guili policy, replacing hereditary chieftains with centrally appointed officials. This policy faced resistance from some local Miao people. Thus, Guizhou remained turbulent during Min-Qing times. For example, in the Ming era, Wang Yangming was tasked with suppressing rebels, and prolonged warfare transformed the local environment. Since Guizhou was mountainous, troops constantly cleared forests for roads and built bridges to move armies. To speed river transport, they dredged shoals, removed obstacles, felled giant trees, and blasted rocks. The Miao often cut down huge trees to block mountain paths and built palisades for self-defense. Terrain shaped warfare, and warfare reshaped the terrain. Despite imperial strength in suppressing revolts, Guizhou's mountainous terrain let Miao rebels vanish into forests and regroup. They'd quickly resume resistance, waging prolonged guerrilla warfare that prevented stable imperial control. Later, Han officials realized lasting peace required transforming the environment through mass migration and agriculture. Additionally, Guizhou's rich mineral and timber resources spurred mining and lumber economies in late imperial times. Profit-seekers mined cinnabar, led zinc ores, and felled giant trees to supply distant markets. Ming poet Yang Shen wrote, "Great halls need beams. Lonely builders pierce misty gloom. Even Beijing sourced palace timber from remote Guizhou. Through these Guizhou and Jiaxing cases, you now grasp how ancients interacted with their environment. But how did they understand the environment they inhabited? Part 3 explores this very topic. First, let's discuss ancient intuitive perceptions of nature. To educated elites, nature manifested cosmic creation, not transient existence, but eternal, comprehensible revelation. Through contemplating landscapes, people gained moral insights and sensory spiritual joy. As Tao Yuanming famously wrote in Drinking, plucking chrysanthemums by the eastern hedge, I glimpse South Mountain in tranquility. Mountain air glows at dusk, birds return together. Here lies true meaning, words fail to capture. He expressed how natural beauty revealed life's essence. In Return to the Fields, he wrote, no dust in courtyard, empty room brings leisure. Long caged, I return to nature, expressing the joy of unrestrained freedom in wilderness. Moreover, some ancients believed landscapes revealed the Tao's self-manifestation, the cyclical dance of complementary forces driving cosmic change. Thus, ancient Chinese developed nature-worshipping cults, religions, and feng shui. Feng shui is a geomantic technique manipulating mystical energies. These energies supposedly permeate homes, tombs, and all natural environments. By adjusting building positions, furniture layouts, or adding features, people could improve feng shui to influence lives and destinies. By late imperial times, most Chinese nobles to commoners believed in feng shui to varying degrees. For example, the Qing dynasty chose Zunhua, Hebei, for imperial tombs, believing its feng shui would protect the dynasty even in its decline. When Li Hongzhang proposed a railway south of Zunhua, rivals accused him of destroying royal feng shui. Beyond daily feng shui, nature worship spawned the state-level concept of heaven-man resonance. Originating in antiquity, the Book of Songs and Documents claimed emperor's virtue influenced climate. Later refined. By Qing times, officials and citizens were held responsible for local weather. Capital weather reflected heaven's judgment on the emperor's conduct. The author argues this theory emerged because northern China's volatile weather created coincidental correlations. During a drought, Emperor Kangxi prayed for rain. Downpour came immediately, making him exclaim, "Even secluded places are under heaven's gaze." Beyond reverence, ancient people had a pragmatic approach toward nature. They viewed nature as humanity's treasure trove, emphasizing bold utilization and transformation of the environment. For example, Zhang Yongquan once wrote, "The Northwest suffers without rivers, thus water projects thrive. The Southeast flooded by rivers, its troubles also arise." Li Zhan wrote, "Observing achievements here, all is human effort. Heaven certainly claims no merit." Through ancient relics in clearing dangerous rapids, they praised humanity's triumph over nature. Ancient emotional understanding of nature was deeply contradictory, revering it as sacred while viewing it as a precious resource for exploitation. Though primarily emotional, scientifically minded individuals rationally observed nature over millennia. Next, let's examine how ancients scientifically viewed living beings. Now, proto-scientific observers possessed strong skepticism, relying on first-hand observation, experience, and logic to uncover truths. Long Chong of Eastern Han critiqued yin-yang and five elements theories through personal observation. He argued, those discussing matters without evidence, though eloquent, won't be believed. He continued, without experimental verification, no amount of talk convinces. Shen Kuo of Song Dynasty emphasized scientific observation of nature. In Dream Pool Essays, he wrote, along Tai-Hang Mountain's northern cliffs, I found embedded snail shells and pebbles. Like bird eggs and rock layers, this was once a western seabed. Now 1,000 li from the sea, the first scientific explanation of land-sea transformation. The author also analyzes Shi Zhaozhe's 5 assorted offerings from Ming Dynasty, showcasing scientific awareness. For instance, the common belief that rabbits conceived by gazing at the moon's male rabbit. He proposed, place rabbits in dark rooms without moonlight. Some still get pregnant. This thought experiment powerfully refuted traditional views. Scientific inquiry was far from mainstream. Pioneers like Xin Kuo and Shi Zhaozhe were driven by personal curiosity, lacking systematic methodology or empirical rigor. For example, Shen Kuo wrote unquestioningly in Dream Pool essays that white chickens turn black in Lingnan and damp wheat transforms into moths. Similarly, Shi Zhaozhe claimed in Five Assorted Offerings that he and others saw a dragon hanging upside down from clouds, gathering water into a column over 100 zhang tall like smoke, visible only to nearby observers. Times change. Many ancient environmental explanations seem unreliable now, but this primitive scientific spirit remained integral to their worldview. The author argues there was no single clear Chinese environmental perspective. Ancient environmental understanding was a kaleidoscope of fragmented, interconnected ideas. Our discussions simply aim to show this kaleidoscope comprehensively from different angles.
In short, China's 4,000-year environmental history is a chronicle of struggle between humans and nature.
As human habitation expanded, animals and forests retreated. Even rivers, lakes, and coastlines were forcibly reshaped. But all this came at a cost. Biodiversity suffered severe damage, massive soil erosion occurred, and floods became frequent. Today, modern science makes us realize humanity's future depends on harmony with nature. Many environmental issues demand urgent solutions. Reviewing China's environmental history now, learning from its lessons, may help us advance further. All right, that concludes our interpretation of The Retreat of the Elephants, a Chinese environmental history. Reading notes are below the audio. See you next time.